Hilchos Eiruvin Perek Sheni, the laws of the Eiruv, of the mixing, chapter 2. Yesterday we learned the core principle of the Eiruv. Technically, by biblical law, if you have a joint space that's shared by multiple people, whether it's a courtyard shared by multiple homes, or an alleyway shared by multiple courtyards, or an entirety of a city shared with access by multiple alleyways, so long as they're enclosed on all four sides, by biblical law, you should be able to carry there. Everyone should be able to carry there. It's treated like a private domain. However, the sages were worried that one might come to lose track because of that of the entire melacha of transferring from private to public domains, and so they said that you cannot carry in these shared spaces unless everybody that has access to the shared space gets involved in an Eiruv, contributes to food, upon which they declare that we now own this entire area jointly. Or more precisely, in the words of the Rambam yesterday, the same way we all have equal access to the public space that we share, so too we all give ourselves equal access to our individual homes, such that nobody is an individual anymore. Nobody has a private space. Everybody owns everything together, and now they become one big unit, and everybody can carry in all the spaces. It's all one big private domain. Today's topic centers around the question of, what if you have an odd guy out? Somebody forgets, or somebody purposely doesn't take part in the Eiruv. Does it ruin it for everybody else, or is there still a way that everybody else in the that has access to the shared space can continue to carry? And we're going to deal with this question on both levels, both on the level of the courtyard, on the larger level of the alleyway. We're also going to deal with whether the person who was out of the Eiruv was a Jew or a Gentile. That also has great ramifications. And that's the topic for today, so here we go. Halacha Aleph, Anshe HaChatzer she'ervu kulan, members of a courtyard who everybody got involved in the Eiruv. They all contributed the food to create this mixture of ownership. Chutz me'echad mehen shalei eirav imahem, besides for one person who didn't join the Eiruv, bein mezid, bein shecheach, whether he was purposeful or he was just forgetful, he forgot to join. Harei zeh oiser aleihem. The baseline principle is that he forbids the rest of them from being able to carry. He cancels the power of the Eiruv. And now nobody can transfer articles from their homes to the courtyard or from the courtyard to their homes. However, there is a workaround. And the workaround is what's called bitul reshut, canceling of ownership. Bitel lohen zeh shaloi eirav, reshus chatzeiroi bilvad. Let me first say it outside before I go into the details of the inside halacha. The bottom line is, every person in the courtyard has a private ownership of their private residence in the courtyard and has an element of joint ownership in the joint space. So before the Eiruv, there were 5 homes in a courtyard. That means that there's 5 people that have separate ownerships of their homes, and then each one owns, let's call it, a fifth of the joint ownership of the shared courtyard. If, let's call him Mr. Red, okay, the odd guy out. Everybody else got involved in the Eiruv. Mr. Red did not. What he needs to do is he needs to nullify his state of ownership from every part that's his in that courtyard. Both his private element of his own home and of the shared element of the courtyard. Once he does that, now he's considered to be a guest by the rest of the people who are at this courtyard, and they all can continue to use the space as a private domain. Just like a guest wouldn't interrupt anybody else from carrying in your own home, so to this guy is considered a guest. If he only chooses to nullify his private residence but not his shared element, or only his shared element and not his private residence, then other laws pertain, as the Rambam begins to detail them right now. If the person who didn't join the Eiruv nullifies the ownership of his portion in the shared property, his portion in the courtyard, so now he becomes a guest as it pertains to the courtyard. Everybody else is now able to move things from their homes to the courtyard or from the courtyard to the homes, because the courtyard has become, under the auspices of the Eiruv, a single unit. But nobody can bring anything into Mr. Red's home, because he still retains private personal ownership of that home. He never handed that off to the rest of the members of the courtyard, and that remains separate from the rest of the Eiruv. But if Mr. Red were to cancel the ownership of both his private residence and of his shared ownership in the courtyard, hare kulam mutarin. Now everybody gets the benefit. Everybody can carry everywhere. Hein, the members who made the Eiruv can carry mipnei she'ervu, because they made the Eiruv. V'hare bitei lahen reshus beisei v'chatzera, and he has handed off to them all of his ownership in this area, both the private and the shared. The gam hu mutar, and counterintuitively, the Mr. Red who forgot the Eiruv, he also becomes permitted to carry everywhere, because he has no authority over any space in this courtyard right now. He's like a guest by the rest of the courtyard members, and a guest never forbids the owners of the home from carrying. He just joins them in whatever they can do. So if they can carry, he can carry too. Halacha beis hamivato reshusay stam. If a Mr. Red forgets to make an Eiruv, or purposely doesn't join the Eiruv, and on Shabbos he decides to nullify his ownership, but he does so without stipulation. Reshus chatzeirei bitel, reshus beisei bitel. By default, we can only assume that he gave up his shared ownership, the ownership that he has in the shared courtyard, but not that he gave up private ownership of his home. And therefore he allows them to move things around, but he cannot. Now, when a person does choose to nullify his ownership of his property to the people of the courtyard, he must make an individual explicit declaration to every single person in the courtyard. And he says, my property, my ownership over my property is hereby nullified to you and to you and to you. He must say so to every individual. An heir can do this process of canceling ownership of his father's property, let's say, even if the person who bequeathed to him the property died on the Shabbos. So let's say Mr. Red was a father to a son. He passes away on Shabbos. The son, on behalf of his father, who now enters in the space of his father, can do the nullification of the ownership on Shabbos. For an heir stands in the place of the person who bequeathed his inheritance to him in every matter. Ubitul reshus b'Shabbos mutar lechatchila, says the Rambam, there are no qualms about this issue. Canceling ownership on Shabbos is something which can be done even initially. Halacha gimel bitlu elu hama'arvin reshusam lezeh shaloi eirav. Let's say the converse happened. There's a Mr. Red who didn't take part in the Eiruv, and instead of him nullifying his ownership to everybody else said, you know what? Let's all be guests by Mr. Red. Let's all nullify our ownerships of our private residences and our shared elements in the courtyard to this guy. What happens is very funny. Hu mutar, the one Mr. Red who didn't make the Eiruv, becomes permitted to carry in the entirety of the courtyard, because he is left alone. He is the sole proprietor. He's the only owner of everything in this courtyard. V'heim asurin. And those people who made the Eiruv but nullified their ownership to him become prohibited to carry in the courtyard, because they have no authority in this courtyard. Now, you just told me before that when Mr. Red cancels his ownership, he can join the party and carry in the Eiruv because he is their guest. So why don't we say the flip side? All the other people who nullified their possessions to Mr. Red should become the guest. We don't say they should be guests by him, because if you have a choice, you don't say that the majority becomes a guest by the minority or by an individual. One individual could be a guest by a bunch of people, but the whole group of people can't be one guy's guests. Till now we're talking about where there's one Mr. Red. What if there's two Mr. Reds or more? Two people didn't take part in the Eiruv. If they nullified their ownership of their property to those who did make the Eiruv, hama'arvin mutar, and everybody who made the Eiruv is permitted. However, in this case, ve'elu shaloi ervu asurin, the ones who actually didn't take part in the Eiruv are prohibited. Two people cannot become the guest by the rest of the people. And also, the flip side can never happen. The people who made the Eiruv cannot nullify their ownership of their property to the two people who did not. Because even if they do, since the two individuals didn't make the Eiruv, they remain separate in and of themselves. And so each one will forbid transferring on the other or on account of the other. Because there's two people who didn't make the Eiruv, they each hold any permission of carrying from taking effect. Even if, let's say, the two Mr. Reds, one would cancel his ownership to the other, he still prohibits. Because at first, when the people who made the Eiruv canceled their ownerships to the first Mr. Red, he was in a state where he was prohibited from carrying. What if the opposite would happen? Commentaries discuss. If the first Mr. Red would nullify his possession to the second Mr. Red, so now you only have in essence one person who didn't make the Eiruv, and then the rest of the people nullified their property to him, he does become permitted. They stay prohibited, as in the last halacha, they can't become his guest, but at least he could. Echad she'erav, einay mevatel reshusei le'echad sheloi erav. One person who made an Eiruv cannot cancel his ownership of property to one person who did not make an Eiruv. The one who did not make an Eiruv can cancel his ownership of possession to somebody who did. The Rambam here is adding if it's a one-on-one. Till now we're talking about a one-on-many. Many made an Eiruv, one didn't. Many didn't make an Eiruv, one did. What if you have a one-on-one? One-on-one, the guy who didn't make the Eiruv is the only one who can nullify his possessions or his ownership to the other. The guy who made the Eiruv cannot nullify his possession to the guy who didn't make the Eiruv. Halacha he, Kashem sheba'al abayis zeh, mevatel reshusei leba'al abayis zeh, b'chatzer achas. The same way the owner of one home can nullify the ownership of his possession to another homeowner in the same courtyard, kach mevatlin mechatzer lechatzer. The same thing can happen from courtyard to courtyard. Members of one courtyard who didn't join the Eiruv of the alleyway can in totality nullify the ownership of their possession to a whole other courtyard. Says the Rambam, another rule, umevatlin v'choizrin umevatlin. Nullification of ownership isn't a permanent thing. You can nullify your ownership, and then the other guy can nullify it back to you. Ketzad, what does that look like? Shnayim shashruyin b'chatzer. Let's say you have two people living in a courtyard. V'lo eirav echad mehan. Nobody made an Eiruv. Mevatel reshusei lasheni. Mr. A can cancel the nullify the ownership of his property to Mr. B. And Mr. B can now carry around in his possession, because the other guy canceled it, till he does all his needs. Then let Mr. B say, you know what, I'm nullifying all the ownership of my possessions to you, Mr. A. And now Mr. A is the sole owner of everything in this courtyard. And Mr. A can now move things around in the possession which was nullified to him, and he is the sole owner of. The same process can be repeated multiple times, no problem. Nullification of ownership can take place in a ruin the same way it takes place in a courtyard. Don't think you have to have properly built homes, residential homes, important homes to be able to do this nullification process. Even if it's a ruin, the person who owns that ruin can conduct this process of nullification of ownership to allow the usage of that area. Halacha vav misha bitel reshusai. Let's say somebody nullified the ownership of his possession because he did it for the good of everybody else and for his own good, so to allow himself to carry. But then he goes ahead and moves things around in the property which he claims to have nullified ownership of. Is that reasserting his own ownership and hence prohibiting everybody else from carrying, or not? If he did it purposely, he prohibits the further usage on the rest of the members of the courtyard. He didn't keep his word. He said, I nullify my ownership to you, do whatever you want, and he didn't. If he did it inadvertently, he doesn't prohibit the usage of the rest of Shabbos on the rest of the people. Because if you asked him, he really does want to keep his word. He really does want to stand by the words that he said. He just forgot. Now, when do we say this whole law? If this is before the rest of the people took a chance to show their possession, to show their ownership of this newly nullified property to them. But if they had already demonstrated their ownership of his new property, in other words, Mr. Red says, I nullify my ownership to you guys, and they did an act which shows that they're in charge of that property, then if Mr. Red goes ahead and carries or moves things around in the property which he claimed himself to have nullified, whether it's inadvertently, whether it's purposely, he cannot prohibit them from using it anymore. Because remember, the moment he nullifies his ownership to them, he becomes their guest. So once they've demonstrated that they're the owners and he's their guest, he can function, he always will function as their guest. And when he carries not on his own accord, but under their jurisdiction. And he cannot make them prohibited from using it further. Halacha zayin, shnei batim, b'shnei tzidei reshus harabim. If you have two homes on two opposite sides of the public domain, of course, should not be allowed to transfer from one to the other. In the middle of Shabbos comes some goyim and they put up a wall encompassing both homes. they've become a courtyard on Shabbos. And they want to carry now. Hey, there's a wall around us, let's go. Ein mevatlin zeh lezeh. So they're going to think, you know what? Let's follow this rabbinic mechanism. Let me cancel my property to you, you cancel to me, we're all in one courtyard. It doesn't work. Because they never had the chance to make the Eiruv yesterday. The whole idea of nullification of ownership is where you had the chance to make the Eiruv, you didn't take that chance, now you can do another loophole and nullify the ownership. But if there was no probability of making the Eiruv before Shabbos, you can't jump in on the bandwagon late and say, I'm going to catch part 2 of the play and do the Bitul Rishus thing. Interesting scenario. Let's say there's a member of the courtyard who in his will it was written that when he dies, his courtyard, all his property goes to a random guy, somebody who's not associated with this courtyard. And he passes away on Shabbos. So now in effect, there's a Mr. Red has been created. There's somebody who owns a property in this courtyard that isn't a part of the Eiruv, because he passed on his property to that random guy. If the person passed away before Shabbos came in, Shabbos entered in the state of this new person owning the property, and he wasn't part of the Eiruv. He forbids the rest of the members of the courtyard from carrying. But if he died once Shabbos already came in, since Shabbos entered in a state where the Eiruv was operating in a kosher way, he does not, the fact that this new member now owns a stake in this courtyard doesn't prohibit the rest of the people of the courtyard from carrying in the courtyard. Now says the Rambam the opposite case. What if there's a random guy who doesn't live in the courtyard, but he owns a house in the courtyard? It's like an empty house in the courtyard. He owns it. And in his will it was written that when he passes away, this house will go to the neighbor who lives in that courtyard. So now he passes away and he leaves his possession to this other member. So there's a house in the courtyard owned by a member of the courtyard who hasn't taken part in the Eiruv. Because when he joined the Eiruv, this guy who now owns the second house, he only did the Eiruv for his own house, not for this newly owned property. Says the Rambam, if the other member passed away before Shabbos, the fact that this new house has entered the courtyard, has entered ownership of the member of the courtyard, doesn't prohibit the rest of the courtyard from carrying, because they all have an Eiruv, and Shabbos came in under the jurisdiction of the Eiruv, and that new house is included. But if that random person passes away once Shabbos comes in, so here the opposite happens. Now, in middle of Shabbos, pops up a house in this courtyard that's not under the jurisdiction of the Eiruv. And that prohibits the rest of the members of the Eiruv from carrying. Unless the newly crowned owner of this home nullifies the ownership of the property of that home to the rest of the courtyard. You basically treat this new house as a Mr. Red. And you say, you know what, I'm going to nullify the ownership of that property to everybody else, and now everybody can carry. Halacha ches, Yisrael v'ger shashuyim b'ma'ara achas, if you have a Jew and a convert who are living in one cave. Now, when a convert has no relatives and he passes away, all of his possessions immediately go to the first person who acquires them. They're considered to be hefker, ownerless, and a Jew who catches them acquires them. So you have a Jew and a convert living in one cave. Umeis hager mi'ba'ed yom, and the convert dies while it's still day, before Shabbos. Even if nobody else took acquisition of the properties of the dead convert until it became dark, till Shabbos came in, the person who now did acquire the convert's properties prohibits the other Jew who's living with the convert from carrying until he nullifies ownership of his property to the other Jew. Because the Jew who acquired the convert's property becomes like his heir. But if the convert passed away once it became dark, after Shabbos already came in, even if another Jew were to come and acquire the dead convert's possessions, he cannot prohibit the first Jew from carrying. He stays in his first state of permission and allowance to carry, because when Shabbos came in, everything was no problem. Till now, we've been talking about where the Mr. Red was a Jew. What about if we're talking about a Gentile? Halacha tes. Yisrael hadar im ha'evet kechavim u'mazales ayim ger toshav b'chatzer. A Jew lives with an idol worshiper or with a resident alien. It's still a non-Jew. He keeps 7 Noahide laws. They live in the same courtyard. Einay oyser alav. The non-Jew does not prohibit the Jew from carrying in the courtyard. Shedira so'evet kechavim u'mazales eina dira ela kivehema hu chashuv. The living quarters of the idol worshiper is not considered to be living quarters for this legal matter. His presence is considered to be the presence of an animal. Just like you have your own animal in your courtyard, it doesn't stop you from carrying in the courtyard. The presence of a non-Jew doesn't interrupt the Jew's permission to carry in the courtyard. That's if it's one-on-one. But if there were 2 Jews or more, and 1 Gentile idol worshiper living with them, he does prohibit the other 2 Jews from carrying even with their Eiruv. Not because logically it should work that way, it's simply a rabbinic decree. Jews shouldn't have idol worshipping non-Jews as their close neighbors. It's very easy to learn from them. If we're so worried about Jews and non-Jews living together, so even in a one-on-one case, when you have a Jew and idol worshipping non-Jew, you should force him to be prohibited to carry on Shabbos, so he shouldn't end up dwelling in such a situation. Says the Rambam, one-on-one usually doesn't even happen. Remember, we learned in the first book of the Rambam, idol-worshipping non-Jews were considered to have a great anti-Semitic bias to Jews. You didn't get close to them very much. The Jew is anyways worried, he's anyways afraid that the idol-worshipping non-Jew will find the opportunity to be alone with him and kill him. The sages already forbade being in seclusion with an idol-worshipping non-Jew because of this fear. So the whole case of a Jew living one-on-one with an idol-worshipping non-Jew in a courtyard wouldn't happen, so the sages didn't decree their decree in this case. It's a common rule in the Talmud that the sages don't decree things in uncommon cases. Halacha Yud, Shnei Yisraelim. You have 2 Jews and 1 idol-worshipping non-Jew living in the same courtyard. And the 2 Jews made an Eiruvin. As we just said, doesn't help at all. The presence of the idol-worshipping non-Jew prohibits the 2 Jews from carrying. And here, where there's a non-Jew involved, even the idea of nullification of ownership of the property doesn't work. If the Jews nullified their property to the idol-worshipping non-Jew, or the idol-worshipping non-Jew nullified the ownership of his property to them, or the Jews decided, you know what, we'll nullify it to each other, and we'll become like a one-on-one, in which case it should be permitted. Doesn't help at all. Because an Eiruv and the presence of an Eiruv doesn't help anything when there's somebody who's idol-worshipping non-Jew in the courtyard. And neither does the cancellation of ownership of property. Also doesn't work when there's a non-Jew involved. The only way is called schirut rishus. There is no way to fix this. The Jews must rent, symbolically, the non-Jew's property from him, and the idol-worshipping non-Jew needs to become like a guest by them. Unlike when it came to Jews, a Jew can become a guest by other Jews simply by handing off the ownership of his property. The non-Jew must rent it to the Jews. They have to rent it from him. And the same would be true if there were multiple idol-worshipping non-Jews in the courtyard. They would rent out their property to the Jews, and the Jews then make an Eiruv, and they become permitted to carry. All you need is 1 Jew. 1 Jew needs to rent the property from the idol-worshipping non-Jew. Then he makes the Eiruv with the rest of the Jews, and they're all permitted. Unlike when it comes to nullifying the property, Jew to Jew. The Jew needs to nullify his property to every single other Jew present in the courtyard. When it comes to renting property from a non-Jew, it only needs to happen once to 1 Jew. By the way, this is pretty common. I know we're talking about courtyards and homes, but the truth is that the same thing applies if you're in an apartment building. Everybody owns their apartment, and then you have a shared space, like the hallways where everybody walks. Technically, all the Jews in the building need to make an Eiruv Chacharis. They need to make an Eiruv to declare their joint ownership over the shared property, and that's when they can carry from apartment to apartment. And if a non-Jew moves into the apartment building, they need to rent his property. I remember when this happened when I was studying in the yeshiva in LA. The building next door to the yeshiva was all occupied by Jewish tenants. They had an Eiruv going, and then 1 non-Jew moved in, and the Rosh Yeshiva had to go and rent the property from the non-Jew. I was kind of struggling to explain, what the whole thing meant. It's kind of a little humorous. But the bottom line is that it happened. They rented his property from him in a symbolic halachic way, and they were allowed to continue using their Eiruv to use the shared areas. Halacha Yud Aleph, Shtei Chatzeros Ulifnei Mizu, if you have two courtyards, one leading into the other. V'Yisrael v'Eivet Kechavim u'Mazoles, Darem b'Pnimis, v'Yisrael Acher b'Chitzena. In the inner courtyard, one Jew and one idol-worshipping non-Jew live. In the outer courtyard, only one Jew lives. Or the opposite. In the inner courtyard, only one Jew lived. In the outer courtyard was one Jew and one idol-worshipping non-Jew. The presence of the idol-worshipping non-Jew prohibits the outer courtyard from carrying until you rent the property from him. Even though in this case, within the courtyard, there's only one Jew versus one idol-worshipping non-Jew, but since everybody needs to get to the outer courtyard to walk out onto the street, so in the end of the day, in the outer courtyard, there's a presence of two Jews and one idol-worshipping non-Jew, in which case, the idol-worshipping non-Jew prohibits the Jews from carrying, as we said before. However, in both cases, the Jew who is inside the inner courtyard can carry in the entire area of the inner courtyard. If he's alone, and of course he can carry. Even in the case where him and the idol-worshipping non-Jew reside, it's a one-on-one. Only one Jew and one idol-worshipping non-Jew enter that property, the innermost property, so they can. And when it's one-on-one, there's no decree. The first Jew can carry on his own in the inner courtyard. Halacha Yud Beis. This rental process of the property can take place even on Shabbos from the idol-worshipping non-Jew. Because this rental isn't a legal rental that would be considered monetary matters. This rental is like canceling ownership. It isn't an actual rental, it's a symbolic rental. Therefore, this rental can take place even for a worth less than a pruta coin. A pruta was the smallest type of currency in Talmudic times, the smallest significant one, I should say. And it was always considered to be like, a level of worth, monetary worth. Something is worth a pruta, it has a worth. Less than a pruta, it has no worth. Typically, a rental cannot take place with less than a pruta. But over here, because it's only a symbolic rental, you can give the goy, the non-Jew, less than a pruta worth and conduct the rental. You can even use the wife of the idol-worshipping non-Jew to do the rental without his knowledge, without his consent. The attendant and the hired worker of the non-Jew can rent out his property without his consent. Even if it was a Jewish attendant or a Jewish hired worker, he can rent out the property without his consent. If a Jew were to go and borrow some space in the idol-worshipping non-Jew's home to put his property, his stuff down, and the non-Jew agreed, he lent out the space, that Jew has already considered to be a partner in the non-Jew's property, umaskir, and he can conduct the rental, without the non-Jew's consent. Obviously, there's all cases where the idol-worshipping non-Jew would be hesitant or not willing to participate, so we find all these loopholes to make it happen. Let's say the idol-worshipping non-Jew had many attendants, many workers, many wives. All we need is one to join our program, be with us on the rental, do the rental, and it's considered rented. Two Jews, one idol-worshipping non-Jew living in a courtyard together. And they did it as they should. They rented their property from the non-Jew. Now you have essentially two Jews living in a courtyard. Just like when it was two Jews on their own. One could cancel ownership of property to the other and then vice versa. They can do this now. Mr. A can give it to Mr. B, and he's allowed to carry. Same thing would happen if the non-Jew died on Shabbos without doing the rental process. Now you just have two Jews left in the courtyard. One Jew can cancel the ownership of his property to the other and allow them to carry. Let's say you have a non-Jew, idol-worshipping non-Jew, rented his property to another non-Jew. Can he do the rental to the rest of the Jews in the courtyard on his behalf? If the rental between the two non-Jews was so binding that the original owner cannot kick out his tenant, until the time of the rental finishes. We, the Jews in the courtyard, have to make the rental from the second guy, from the tenant. Because he entered in place of the owner. But if the original landlord still retains the power over the house and he can kick out the tenant whenever he wants, so if the renter, the tenant, is not present, and the Jews went ahead to the landlord and rented his property from him, that's enough of a rental, and that allows the permission of the rest of the courtyard to carry through the mechanism of the Eiruv. You have a courtyard, little picture here perhaps, with Jews and one idol-worshipping non-Jew living there. And there were windows between the Jewish homes. So all the Jewish homes were essentially one home, connected by a series of windows. And these Jews said, you know what? We're not going to make an Eiruv in the courtyard. We're going to make an Eiruv to connect the homes. The windows are going to connect all our properties that are adjacent and make them into one unit. Even though they can now, by means of this Eiruv, carry from one home to another through the windows, they cannot leave their doors and carry things out the door. Because of the presence of the non-Jew, till he rents out his property. The reason the Rambam has to say this is because one might think that by making the window Eiruv, they became one home. And now it's like one-on-one, and one-on-one works without the non-Jew's involvement. Says the Rambam, the idea of converting a multitude into an individual doesn't work when there's a presence of a non-Jew there. He disturbs that process from happening. And so they still are limited they're barred from carrying out their door till they take care of the non-Jew's presence by renting his property. Halacha Tezayin, says the Rambam, quite harsh. Yisrael shu mechal Shabbos b'farhesia. A Jew who violates Shabbos publicly, defiantly. Or he serves idols. A Jew serves idols. He becomes like an idol worshiper in all matters. He can't be part of an Eiruv. He cannot nullify ownership of his property. We must rent his property from him, treat him as though he were an idol worshipping non-Jew. But if he was simply a heretic, doesn't worship idols, doesn't violate the Shabbos, like the Sadducees and the Baitusim, who are also an offshoot movement of the Sadducees, and all those who deny the oral Torah, but they still kept somewhat of the written Torah. Bottom line being, anybody who doesn't agree, doesn't admit, doesn't acknowledge the truth of the mitzvah of Eiruv, because they don't believe in rabbinic law. You cannot conduct an Eiruv with him, because he doesn't agree to the whole principle. But you also cannot rent from him, because he isn't an idol worshiper. He's somewhat of a believer, somewhat not. What you could do is, he retains his status as a Jew insofar as he can cancel ownership of his property to a proper Jew, and that will be the way to fix the rest of the courtyard, allow them to carry. The same thing if it was one-on-one. One Jew and one apostate Jew living in a courtyard. The presence of the apostate Jew prohibits the regular Jew from carrying in the courtyard until he nullifies ownership of his property to the proper Jew, and then the proper Jew can carry in the courtyard with no problems.